Okay, so the source builds its case in three main parts. We're going to start with the first one, the alleged harms to the social fabric, and it kicks off with one of history's most debated topics.
The argument opens with this law right here, from the Old Testament book of Leviticus. Now, this verse is pretty explicit. It permits the buying of foreign people and their children as slaves, and not just for a while, but forever, as an inheritance.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting, because the source connects that Old Testament law to this very famous statement from the New Testament. Here, the character of Jesus says point blank that his purpose is to fulfill the law, not to get rid of it.
And that right there is the core of the argument. By linking these two verses, the source comes to a stark conclusion. If you vow to fulfill a law, and that law includes eternal slavery, well then that's basically an endorsement of eternal slavery.
From there, the argument pivots away from social law and towards social unity, pointing to this quote, "The mission stated right here isn't peace, it's division. And according to this analysis, a mission to deliberately create division is, by its very nature, a destructive one."
This next point is a perfect example of how the source reframes familiar stories. We all know the parable of the Good Shepherd, right? But in this view, it's not a story about love, it's a story about profound recklessness. I mean, leaving 99 sheep totally defenseless in the wilderness to go find one is presented as a huge catastrophic risk that endangers the vast majority for the sake of just one.
And finally, to wrap up this case against society, the source takes on that famous line about Caesar. It completely dismisses the idea that this was some kind of clever way to dodge a question. Instead, it's read as a literal command: submit to and validate a false society of false idols. Basically reinforcing worldly power, not challenging it.
All right, let's move on to the second part of this argument and see how it builds. We're shifting focus now from the wider society to the family unit itself, which the source claims is a primary target for division.
The analysis presents this verse from Luke as Exhibit A. It is just incredibly blunt. To be a disciple, a follower is told they must hate their entire family. The source's reading of this command leaves absolutely no room for metaphor. And then, boom, it's immediately contrasted with one of the 10 commandments from Exodus. The source puts hate thy father and mother right up against honor thy father and mother to argue that this new teaching is fundamentally lawless and a direct reversal of established divine law.
The conclusion drawn from this is, well, pretty severe. The source claims that telling people to cut ties with their family and to actively cultivate hatred for their loved ones is a classic tactic of an abusive cult leader. It's designed to isolate people and make sure their loyalty is to the leader and the leader alone.
And it doesn't stop there. This idea is reinforced with another passage, this time from Matthew. The source points to this as an explicit declaration of intent. The mission, as stated, is to create conflict right inside the family, turning your own home into a house of enemies.
Okay, this brings us to the third and final part of the case against the self. And this is where the source argues the teachings go beyond harming society and family to promoting direct harm to the individual follower. The analysis here uses a really stark analogy to make its point. It starts with the famous command to resist not evil. The argument is that if you actually follow this command, you're basically deactivating all of your personal defenses. The source then compares this to a kind of spiritual immune deficiency, leaving a person totally vulnerable to any and all forms of abuse.
From there, the arguments for self-harm become even more direct and, frankly, more physical. The source highlights this passage, which talks about 3 different kinds of eunuchs, and specifically includes those who have done it to themselves for the kingdom of heaven's sake.
Now, what the source finds really disturbing here is a couple of things. First, it insists that the text gives zero indication that this is a metaphor, so it has to be read as a literal option for self-castration. And second, it points out the really unsettling sequence in the text, where this discussion is immediately followed by an encounter with little children.
And this is probably the most shocking claim in the entire analysis. It centers on this passage from the Gospel of John, where followers are told they have to eat flesh and drink blood to get eternal life.
So let's be super clear on the interpretation here. The source doesn't see this as a symbolic ritual. It reads it as a literal instruction for cannibalism and blood drinking. It argues the text even contrasts this new bread with the manna that their ancestors ate, presenting it as a new, and very literal, path to immortality.
So after going through the alleged harms to society, to the family, and to the self, the source presents its closing argument. Let's just quickly summarize the final charges as they're laid out.
The case, as presented, accuses the central character of endorsing slavery, of deliberately dividing nations and families, of promoting reckless behavior, and of demanding hatred for your own loved ones. And it all culminates with charges of instructing followers not to resist any kind of evil and proposing literal self-mutilation and cannibalism.